Hey guys, welcome back. So for this one, we are getting into what is effectively the extreme Venomverse, which is the series leading into Death of the Venomverse. And as we head into this, we're shown different Venoms from different worlds with very different stories. So as we hop in, we're just getting to know a few of them, while in the bigger picture, we also discover why the Venomverse is facing extinction. So with that said, let's get into it. But first, if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to catch the spills every week. And don't forget to hit that bell up top so we can squad up in the comments for the first hour. Alright, so for this one, we begin by heading back to Web of Spider-Man issue 1, which is the classic and iconic issue when Peter once again got rid of the symbiote, which is a story that began when the symbiote returned to Peter after he believed that he had left it at the Baxter building. So now with him trying to get back to the Baxter building, he's hoping that he can get back to Reed Richards so that he can help him remove the symbiote again and contain it. But on his way, the symbiote fought back. It stopped shooting webs, and it nearly immobilized Peter from heading in that direction at all. But while Peter was trying to sort this out, he was attacked by a group of ex-cons who were all suited up with the equipment of Adrian Toomes, who called themselves the Volturians. But during this fight, Peter veered off with one of these guys, and I want to say his name was Honcho. But the two of them veered off, running right into a church bell, which from here is where the iconic moment that we all remember happens, when Peter realized that the painful sound of this church bell up close was the solution to getting rid of this symbiote. But at the time, Louise Simonson gave us this story with a huge emphasis of Peter sacrificing himself and possibly having his brain turned to jello in this act of desperation, which would have killed Peter. But fortunately, in this act of desperation, in Web of Spider-Man issue 1, before Peter died, the symbiote grabbed him and dragged him down the stairs, saving Peter's life. And at the time it was said, because the symbiote had been bonded with Peter for so long, a being who feels intensely fear, greed, excitement, responsibility, love, it was for this reason that the symbiote had learned to feel, and along with it learning to feel, also because of Peter, it learned how to act on those feelings. And this is why in the original telling, the symbiote came back and saved Peter. But then quickly we come to find out that this story didn't turn out the same way that it did on Earth 616, because on this Earth, the symbiote just left Peter up there to die. And this time around, with the story that we're given from Ryan North, we find that the symbiote had learned something very different from Peter, because Peter wanted to be better. He wanted to do better. He didn't always succeed, but he always tried. And with the symbiote letting Peter die, this was a selfish act that it soon after regretted. And this feeling of regret is now what made the symbiote even more like Peter, who lost his Uncle Ben because of a selfish act, an irreversible mistake. So when the symbiote goes down into the church and finds Eddie, the two of them bond quickly, because they're both looking for forgiveness, where for the symbiote, it's what it's just done, and for Eddie, it's what he was about to do. So from here, with the symbiote bringing along with it the best parts of Peter, the best parts of Spider-Man, this causes the symbiote to connect with a different side of Eddie than what we'd seen before. So aside from Eddie and the symbiote bonding from the two of them seeking forgiveness, Eddie is now compelled by the parts of Peter that wanted to do better, which have now come along with the symbiote. But it's soon when we come to realize that for Eddie, even still with him having this new sense of great power and responsibility, though he wants to act on it, he still struggles a bit with the implementation of it, which we see in action as he chases down Doc Ock, who's fleeing a bank robbery, which in the old days is how Doc Ock used to fund his projects. But with Eddie chasing him into this warehouse, he webs him up, and when Otto says something along the lines of getting rid of this city's spider problem, Eddie responds with saying things like, you know, that gets under my skin, as well as things like, you and I wouldn't have a spider problem if Otto wasn't running around hurting people, which is an unusual use of pronouns for Eddie Brock with the symbiote. And that's something that we'll circle back around to in just a little bit. But with Otto calling out Eddie for not being the original Spider-Man and telling him that they may use the same self-righteous tone as if they're just better than everyone else, Otto tells him if one Spider-Man can die, so can this one. So Otto uses his extra arms to catch Eddie off guard, and the first attack doesn't work, but then when he uses Sonics, he realizes that that's what this Spider-Man is vulnerable to. So of course, in response, with the symbiote going unstable, Eddie is just left hanging in his BVDs, and those are the draws, by the way. Eddie got those BBDs. But at this point, with Otto having a much bigger smile on his face than I'm comfortable with right now, Otto begins to talk about how he's better than just taking this interesting goo away from Eddie. And for Eddie, it's here in this moment where, like I mentioned before, he knows the difference between the good that he was compelled to do by the symbiote versus the good that he wants to do and the way he wants to do it. So he grabs a brick and he tosses it at Otto's head just before racing back to check on the symbiote, who Eddie prays isn't dead. But then it's here where Otto, who definitely was out for a second, like I have no doubt that that brick hit the reset button, this man just rebooted. But now that he's conscious again, he tells Eddie that was just a cheap shot, it won't work twice, because he's not Spider-Man, he's just some guy. And at this point we find that Eddie and the symbiote have figured it out, because they tell Otto that he's right. Eddie is not Spider-Man, but Eddie won't be on his own anymore, because it's us, the symbiote and Eddie, and we're Spider-Man. And from there, Spider-Man knocks Otto out, because in addition to Eddie having his symbiote back, with the two of them being even closer and working out their insecurities, a stronger symbiosis makes them stronger as well. To where next, after putting Otto back to sleep, they just web him up and leave him hanging for the police to come get. And I gotta say, hopefully Otto doesn't fall asleep, because that's the last thing you want to do when you got a concussion. And I mean, hopefully we'll be able to check on this guy later just to see if he's okay. But as Spider-Man leaves, it's here where they're then met by Agent Venom and Wayne, who's someone we haven't seen in a long time. But with her coming here, she lets them know about someone going through realities killing Venoms, so they all have to group up and stick together. But after this, we then go to the second of 3 stories, where we find Eddie Brock and Anne Wayne, who are living a bit more of a domesticated life, with it being the two of them and their son Dylan. But on this night, one of their worst fears has become a reality, with Dylan discovering a symbiote secret that the two of them could have prepared him for prior to this moment. But we end up discovering that Dylan was found by a girl named Leah, who's a young orphan about Dylan's age, living on her own. And when Dylan wakes up, of course he doesn't know where he's at, but nonetheless he's ready to keep it moving. And this girl Leah then tells Dylan that the two of them should team up because she's actually a runaway. She ran away from an orphanage, and she can tell that Dylan ran away too. But when Dylan declines her offer, she then teases him by telling him that he probably ran away for something petty, like mommy and daddy not buying him a new toy. And with hearing that, Dylan snaps, which from here causes his symbiote to take over. And with this one, this version of the Venom symbiote, it's very aggressive. It picks up this car, trying to shake the little girl out so it can eat her, while at the same time for Dylan, who's trying to fight against it, the symbiote is telling him that he's young and he's weak, and eventually it's going to overpower him and pretty much just use his body as a puppet, while locking his consciousness away. But through the course of this second story, which is a much shorter one, Dylan's parents, Anne and Eddie, they both come after him together. And when they do, we come to find out that they are all Venom. Like, each of them have a Venom symbiote. And with this one, it's not really fully explained as far as how exactly this works or how it came about, but instead it's really more of a teaser just introducing us to this family, with us seeing both Anne and Eddie saving their son and stepping out of their comfort zone to make this Venom family work, instead of suppressing and hiding what's a part of them. And with this one, we see it end pretty much with the family also taking in Leah, who may or may not have a symbiote now. Because really, all of these stories are giving us a glimpse into the extreme Venomverse just before the huge summer event brings it all together. But for this last one, we're given a story called Tip of the Blade, written by Leonardo Romero. And I gotta admit, when we go to this Earth, with its post-apocalyptic landscape, I can't help that it's giving Final Fantasy VII vibes, with the floating Oscorp city looking down on the slums. But when we hop in here, we see this train rushing away, with a number of civilians on board. And at this point, the Scorpion has come here, looking for one passenger, and one passenger only, who's a man by the name of Takemoto Tatsuya, who previously worked for Oscorp and was sent underground to investigate a strange signature, but when he found the source, the relic liquefied and covered his body, to where from there he became Samurai Venom. And to give a little bit more background on this, we're really just told that he's being chased by Oscorp because they want that symbiote. And for Takemoto, he's not sure if he can tame this symbiote, but he's aware that it's capable because the moment it bonded with him, the Osborn soldiers opened fire and he handled them all. So from here, where we see him pretty much come out from hiding and attack the Scorpion, who's threatening these passengers, who are really just civilians with their families trying to get away from where they were. A woman named Marion helps out by shooting Scorpion with the EMP, to where from there, Samurai Venom just throws Scorpion off the train. But then just a few moments later, after a brief debate on whether Samurai Venom should be thrown off next, with him being the one that Osborn's after, since the Scorpion is only one of 6 who Oscorp could have sent. implying that they have their own version of the Sinister Six. But before they know it, Scorpion gets backup from Oscorp, who comes in blowing up the rear of the train just moments before it can get to the tunnel ahead, which is said to be the point where Oscorp can't follow the train anymore. So Samurai Venom ends up getting all the passengers to the front before the Scorpion's backup comes in for another shot. And as the last couple of carts go speeding towards the tunnel sideways, Samurai Venom holds on to the Scorpion, causing the both of them to be there upon impact, but only one of them walks away. And after this, weeks later, we find that Takemoto is approached by Anne Wang, who gives him the speech about all the Venoms coming together. And with him sensing from her that she is in control with her symbiote, he trusts what she's saying, and he feels compelled to join the fight. But also, he goes along with her, knowing that this issue is way bigger than the heat that he's under here. Alright, so with us jumping back into this, we're going to be hopping around to quite a few different Earths, starting with Earth 258, which is like a parody of Amazing Spider-Man issue 258, because for the most part, on this Earth, everything has happened the same way, except for a few events that had taken place within this issue. Because amongst these changes, the first one that we see takes place after Peter dropped off the symbiote with Reed Richards after discovering it was alive. But on this Earth, after Reed steps away, we discover that Felicia Hardy followed Peter there, with her initially doing this out of concern for his safety. Because it wasn't long before this when Felicia popped up on Peter while Mary Jane was there, and it went from what originally was MJ telling Peter she knows his secret, she knows that he's Spider-Man, to Felicia showing up and not only confirming that, but also giving her an up-close look at what Spider-Man been swinging around with. And I mean, you know, MJ wasn't wrong, because we know good and well what was going on them rooftops, and you can't really blame Peter, because MJ had him in the perpetual friend zone. But at this time, after MJ had already left, this moment played out just like it did on Earth 616, with Felicia getting ready to leave, which then had Peter like, no, I won't let you run out on me too. So he reached out his hand and the symbiote webbed her up. Which now for Felicia on Earth 258, this had her following Peter to keep an eye on him, which led her to following him to the Baxter building and overhearing the truth about the symbiote being alive, which then caused her to put a couple of things together, because she also realizes when she was about to go out that window, it was the symbiote that didn't want her to go, not Peter. And since the two of them care for Peter, but he doesn't care for them, this led Felicia to believe that they had some things in common. So she lets the symbiote out, and it bonds with her shortly after. But of course, this sets off the alarm. So Reed, Peter, and Johnny go rushing back to Lab 3, only to get there and discover that the symbiote has already bonded with Felicia. But also, before we go on to the next story with the next Earth, I also want to point out that it's explained to us here with Felicia being a professional thief. She's able to outwit Reed Richards, and not so much outsmart him, but outwit him by sabotaging his security measures and doing things like switching out his sonic gun housing with the brain chemistry scanner, since she had been here watching and listening for some time, so she already knew what they were going to try once she put on the suit. But after a bit of a scuffle and Peter trying to tell Felicia that having this symbiote can't be good for her because it wants to bond permanently, and Felicia responds to Peter by saying maybe that's why it got so stressed when it was on you, because you see that as a problem, the same way you're so scared of a permanent bond with me. And right there, just like, oh man, now you gonna turn this into a thing about commitment issues. It's messed up. And after this, Felicia just walks right out with the symbiote as the all-new Black Cat, and as she goes on her way, she's spotted by Agent Venom and Wayne, who, like we saw in part 1, she's aware of the Venoms being hunted around the multiverse. Though she's not sure who exactly is doing the hunting, she does know that she's got to make her rounds to gather and protect as many Venoms as possible. And after this, next we head to Earth 345 for what is probably one of my favorite stories coming from these different Earths, because this one takes place while Eddie Brock was in prison with Cletus Cassidy. But on this Earth, Cletus killed Eddie in prison, so the Deputy S.H.I.E.L.D. Director, Dum Dum Dugan, placed a modified life model decoy in a cell as a way of tricking the Venom symbiote to bond with it, so that Dugan could capture and lock away the Venom symbiote for what could have possibly been the next 1,000 years. Because this life model decoy has been modified with synthetic hormones, artificial tissue, adaptable security hardware, and the molecular fusion core, so it could hang on to the symbiote, keep it in line, and sustain this forceful bond for the next 1,000 years, which is pretty wild, because the plan also with doing this was just to haul Venom off to the Life Foundation. But while this symbiotic bond is taking place, Dugan tells the symbiote what happened to Eddie, and the symbiote lashes out as it alters this life model decoy, modifying it in ways that Director Dugan wasn't expecting. And to make matters worse, this life model Venom, which is the name that was given to him by Dum Dum Dugan, it frees the prisoners, and then it makes a plasma blade. But before he can get to Dugan, a portal opens up, and it's Carnage. Cause the Carnage symbiote has been making its way across the multiverse, hunting down Venoms as the next stage in its elaborate plan. And now the life model Venom's next on the list. But when Dugan tries to make his way to the radio tower to call for backup, the life model Venom cuts him off, demanding that he gives him the voice print so that the symbiote can detach itself from the life model decoy. And without warning, Carnage stabs Dum Dum Dugan through the back, which not only kills him because on this Earth Dugan is a human rather than a life model decoy, but it also destroys this Venom's chances of being freed from its prison, because only this Dugan had the passcode to get this Venom out. So naturally this Venom goes off on Carnage, knocking him into the next room onto an MRI machine. But keep in mind also, on this Earth, this Venom has never met Carnage before, with part of that reason being Cletus Cassidy killed Eddie Brock in prison, which kind of fudged up the whole Origin of Carnage thing from ever happening on this Earth. But while they're fighting, the Carnage symbiote puts the life model Venom into the MRI machine, which causes his machine components to go crazy, as Carnage just hops on top of him and gets to slashing. And just when it seems like Carnage is about to finish this life model Venom off, the LMV turns one of his arms into a cannon, and he blasts Carnage through the roof and out of the building, which gets rid of Carnage just long enough for Agent Venom Anne Wang to make her way there and get the LMV to safety. But when she arrives, she tells this Venom symbiote that she's gonna get it out of this prison, only for it to let her know that it is the prison, now that it's stuck on this life model decoy, with the Dum Dum Dugan of this world being a dead Dugan. And right after this, we take a peek at what's going on other worlds, like Earth 311, where here this Venom, he's a court jester, and the last one alive on his world at that, because across the lands, there's been word of a Red Death that has crept into their kingdom, proving itself to be more fatal than any pestilence this world has seen. And of course, it's not long before we find out that this Red Death is Carnage. And before any of these guys get to even remotely realize what's actually going on here, Carnage makes quick work of this Venom, as well as the other members of this royal court, because the Carnage symbiote came here to get down to business. And from what it sounds like, the Carnage symbiote spent more time on this world than he probably wanted to. And I mean, don't take me wrong, he's still gonna dress up and get into character, but going forward, he's got a lot of other Venoms to get to. An Extreme Venomverse is going to pick up and continue that journey for the Carnage symbiote going forward from here. And after this, we head over to another universe, where in this case, we're not given the specific numeric designation, which makes sense, because in most cases, those are only given to the Earths that have characters that people like enough for them to stick around. So just as a heads up, there's going to be a few worlds that we jump to that are introduced without an Earth designation number. But either way, on this world, we arrive at what seems to be like your Pleistocene era, which is the time period of your mammoths, mastodons, saber-toothed cats, Neanderthals, and so on. And it's here where we come across a girl by the name of Dill Ann, who was cast out by her tribe after her father Brock, who was known to be an unlucky man, had passed. And the main reason her people casted her aside was because her father often spoke of her being destined for greatness. But in their native language, the word that translates to greatness is the same word used for catastrophe. So frankly, her people wanted no parts of it. But after being cast out, Dill Ann was nearby when a meteor struck, which on one hand saved her life by killing the saber-toothed tiger, but on the other hand, out from this crater came a symbiote that bonded with her shortly after. And we're also shown on this world that the Kree Navy has been harvesting primitives, because the Supreme Intelligence says that these people have enormous genetic potential, which in a lot of ways is similar to the history we got on Earth 616, because the Kree did experiment on humans there as well, until the Supreme Intelligence got a look at that data and realized the experiments will become too powerful. But nonetheless, it's here where we see one of these soldiers wander off to drop a deuce, but on his way he's attacked by Dill Ann, who together with her symbiote, their name translates into Black Fang. And as it turns out, this symbiote that would have became Venom under different circumstances, it ends up imitating the abilities that it sees from the creatures in this time, and for the most part that of your saber-toothed tiger, because initially when this symbiote arrived, it was gonna bond with one, but it ended up killing the poor kitty on impact, so it made its way to Dill Ann next. and for some time the two of them find their purpose by slaying the Kree and becoming the lethal protectors of the native people who were enslaved by them for so long. And eventually Agent Venom and Wang makes her way here, recruiting Dylan and warning her of what's to come. And after this, on the next Earth, we head into a very old Western setting where we're introduced to Edna Brock, who initially is introduced as Madam Brock, but she goes by a number of names. She's a card reader and a businesswoman who finds herself indebted to a young man by the name of Parker, who is also referred to as Webslinger. And what's interesting is that we're shown more or less through the Webslinger's eyes Edna's routine with her going from Madam Brock, the card reader slash businesswoman, over to Madam Venom, the enforcer, who's willing to go to the extreme using lethal methods, all of which the Webslinger doesn't agree with. But the long and short of this story is that the Webslinger was just passing through and he ended up saving one of Madam Venom's escorts from an unhappy customer who later came back, and that's when Madam Venom went loose with her and her girls, making sure that these men would never come back again. Literally. And after that, she repaid the Webslinger with some supplies and sent him on about his way. And not too long after, Agent Venom and Wang made her way here to recruit Madam Venom, but she already knew that Anne was coming because the cards told her so. And following this, in the next universe, we're introduced to Flash Thompson, Venom, Space Knight, which from what it seems, and we're not really shown a whole lot, but from what it seems in this universe, Flash Thompson just never stopped being Venom Space Knight, and I'm not mad at that one bit. And when we find him here, he's stopping a space pirate named Titus, who's losing the fight, so he sends the both of them out the airlock, which kind of feels like a reference to Venom Space Knight issue 1. And next, they get pulled into the gravity of a nearby planet, which sends Flash and his symbiote crashing down. And it's here where he's then approached by Agent Venom and Wang, who fills him in on what's going on and brings him aboard the team. But I also like when Anne finds him here, she tells him, "I like your style," which I guess is to be expected coming from Agent Venom. But I also gotta say, Venom Space Knight was one of the best looking versions of Venom, hands down. And really, if somebody were to make a list of the best looking versions of Venom, Flash Thompson would easily get 3 spots out of the top 5. Feel free to let me know what you guys think in the comments. Alright, so for this first world that we traveled to, Earth TRN 1063, we're only given the title Bloom of Doom, which quickly gives us this short story with no written context, no monologue, no narration, just the visuals, with it really just serving the purpose of showing us more of what's happening around the Venomverse. But long story short, or short story even shorter, we're shown symbiote material falling from space, landing on this unnamed world, which is a mixture of fantasy and what looks to be a version of normal reality, because on one hand, when the symbiote lands on some flowers, a fairy goes to check it out, only to get eaten by this flower venom after getting way too close, which is then followed by the symbiote growing and consuming more as its living darkness takes over what was once a beautiful forest in this world. And from how this is done, as this venom symbiote grows and spreads, it consumes what was once the nature of this land, killing the other fairies and eventually spreading across this planet to other areas where you would have what would seem to be normal people in a normal city getting rained on by this symbiote, which is how it spreads itself out to the rest of this world. And that's pretty much it. It's pretty dark, pretty twisted, and it almost feels like this particular portion of the Venomverse anthology was kinda going for a love, death, and robots kind of vibe, cause if Extreme Venomverse was delivered like that TV show, this would be one of the shortest and creepiest portions that we'd probably see, with no words, just music and visuals. And after this, the next Earth we head over to, Earth 90214, the home universe of Spider-Man Noir. We arrive in May of 1941, where here we find Eddie Brock is a minister who's been spending the church's tithes on alcohol and gambling. So eventually he's confronted by Mr. John D. Ward, who tells Father Eddie that he needs to pay up or he's gonna let it be known that Father Eddie's a terrible blackjack player. But with how this goes, John D. Ward, which is pretty much Edward if you switch the D and the E, he gives Father Eddie some extra time so they can talk about it later. So Father Eddie gets on his knees praying for forgiveness and help. So he reads a scripture that says, "In the teeth of the beast will I send upon them with the venom of crawling things of the dust," which he doesn't understand one bit. and I don't blame him. He might have got that Bible off of Wish.com, who knows. But later on while he's at the church, he hears a dripping sound, so he goes to check it out, only for this mysterious drip to turn out to be a symbiote that immediately bonds with him. And going forward, the two of them, they do take on the Venom moniker, with Father Eddie more or less just taking the name from the scripture, but with them going forward on their mission, so to speak, a new name would be given to them by the public, and it's a name that they would be referred to by most on this world. Because going forward, we see this take shape first when they pay a visit to John Deward, who's the same guy that came by the church trying to collect from Father Eddie. And it's kind of messed up how this happens, because at first John's trying to talk to Eddie, telling him how, we go way back, because for some time prior to this, these guys were friends. But now Eddie just lets him know that there's a new we now. We are a servant of God, and our name isn't Eddie, it's Venom. And right after that, they eat poor Johnny. And the next morning, Father Eddie believes that this whole thing was just a dream until he hears the news on the radio about what happened, with the media saying that half of John Deward's body was eaten by a creature called the Sin Eater that carved the word sinner on John's chest. And this is just followed by the symbiote confirming to Eddie that it's all true, with it telling him that it really happened. It had to be done. It was regrettable, of course. The deaths of the innocent are always regrettable, but the innocent must sometimes be sacrificed for the greater good. Fear not, Eddie Brock, for I am with you. We are one. And later that same day, Father Eddie is paid a visit by Detective Stan Carter from the NYPD, because the detective heard that not too long ago, Eddie and John were seen stumbling out of the tavern with no name. So the detective asked Father Eddie about him even being there, because it's not exactly, kind of place you'd find a man of the cloth. So Eddie responds like, did not the Lord himself walk amongst sinners? Which then has the detective like, sinners? Red flag. But he doesn't pry too much further. He just asks Father Eddie if he has any information that he think might be helpful, like if John shared anything useful, if he had any enemies, only for Father Eddie to tell him no. John was quiet and reserved, but if he thinks of anything, he'll be sure to get back to him. And after this, when Father Eddie is paid a visit by a young man named Emil Gregg, who comes by the church for a confession while also going on about the news he heard about the Sin Eater, saying that he's been hearing voices, and as it turns out, Father Eddie's using this guy as a setup, because he tells Emil Gregg that they'll have a personal session at his home later. But before Father Eddie heads over there, he calls Detective Carter, telling him that he's got to break his oath of silence to tell him about Emil Gregg. So he makes sure to show up at Emil's home first, before the detective, to give Emil this whole speech about sharing his power, only to get Emil to use the symbiote briefly, to jump out the window and make a whole scene, so Detective Carter would believe that Emil was the Sin Eater this whole time. And it's messed up because you can tell that Emil had some issues from the beginning, because it's those issues that are still there even after the symbiote leaves Emil, which have him echoing the voices that he heard, voices that more recently came from the symbiote, now compelling him to confess to the murder of John Deward. And it causes the story that Father Eddie told Detective Carter over the phone to check out completely, with him now having the symbiote back and Detective Carter none the wiser. And after this, we then head over to Earth TRN 1064, where we find the young schoolgirl Ellie Ellison, who on the surface seems like your regular high school kid, which for the most part she is, except for the fact that her hair bow is a symbiote, which at the first sight of danger allows her to transform into this world's lethal protector, Necroco. And there's really not much more to this one. She's got a crush on one of her classmates, Parker Piper, who later gets bit by a radioactive spider, and it's teased that they're gonna team up. And on another Earth, we got Kate Bishop along with Jeff the Land Shark, who has the Venom symbiote on this Earth, so the two of them go for a bit of a wacky adventure, which really just takes them from playing in the park to going to a concert. And after this, on the next Earth, we get a story called Field of Screams. And for this story, I'm kinda split down the middle with it, cause in this world, you got Ed Brock, sports reporter, who's investigating the murder of his cousin Richie, who was mysteriously killed while working at the stadium as one of the grounds crew. So Ed snoops around only to find out that the whole team been juicing and shooting up on some kind of phage drug. So he ends up taking them down. But when it went on to tell the backstory of how meteors struck in his backyard when he was 18, so he went to check it out, and turns out it was a symbiote, and he used it to become Major League Venom. And I was just kind of like, I guess. Cause I totally understand. Anytime we do the whole Venomverse song and dance, we're gonna get some wacky characters. And it's almost guaranteed to be a mixed bag, which is fine. cause most of the time when we see something in Venomverse, chances are we're not gonna see much of it again. That is, if the history is anything to go by. But also it's kind of the point of this for the writers to have fun and just make one of the most ridiculous Venoms you can think of. And that is precisely what Major League Venom is. But after he's done taking down the whole team, he's met by Agent Venom and Wang, who invites him to the biggest fight he'll ever see. And after this, these last two that we get for Extreme Venomverse, bringing this event to a close, both of these stories, for me, fall under the I would have liked to have seen more category. Because in this world, Earth TRN 1066, we land in what is pretty much a symbiote version of Pacific Rim, where in this case the mechs are single piloted, so that's different. But aside from that, it's the same concept. Cause jumping in, we're shown this world 20 years after First Contact, where a seasoned mech pilot Flash Thompson is dropped into the fight as the last line of defense against these two symbiote kaiju. And with how this goes, he takes down the first one rather quickly, only to find out that the second one is just way tougher. And I gotta say, looking at this, it isn't so much that I'd like to see a drawn out event, 6 issues plus or whatever, but I do believe perhaps a season or 2 of an anime production would do this story a lot of justice. But through the course of this, after Flash eventually defeats this second symbiote kaiju, his mech is totally wrecked, so he has to wait for someone to come pick him up. But during the time that he's waiting, we get to learn a bit more about this Earth's Flash Thompson, who again is much older and seasoned. On this Earth, he only lost 1 leg instead of 2, and he keeps this old picture of himself and Peter Parker that he talks to every now and then, since this Peter died many years ago. And right there, from seeing that, I just assumed that the Peter Parker of this world had an influence on Flash, similar to 616 Spider-Man's influence on the main universe Flash Thompson. And I think something like that just really works for a story like this. And when this ride eventually gets there, we get a glimpse at both Gwen Stacy and Miles Morales in their mechs, which again leaves me just wanting more. And now for the last story. We return to Earth 21619. Which is one that a few of you guys might be familiar with if you tuned in for my coverage on Chip Zdarsky's Spider-Man Spider Shadow, which was a top tier horror story about Peter Parker keeping the symbiote and committing all sorts of Spider-Man slaughter. And in case you missed it, I got a link in the description where you can get caught up on the big spill when I talked about the series from start to finish. But it's here in Extreme Venomverse where we pick up from the epilogue, where we saw that the Kingpin survived his brutal attack from symbiote Spider-Man, because at the time it took a few attempts from Wesley and the scientists to share with Fisk their most recent discovery, because he was so obsessed and enraged about Peter walking away from everything that happened without any consequence, and more or less continuing his role as a hero as if none of this had ever happened. Because if you guys remember, not long after Peter had finally been separated from the symbiote, it took over Reed for a brief while, and it ended up killing him before everything was over, which later took us into Peter's trial, where he was eventually found not guilty, to where then later we got a moment of reconciliation between him and Sue that led to Peter joining the Fantastic Four of this universe. Which again, it's all of these things put together that infuriated the Kingpin, because not only did he see it as Peter doing these things and getting away with it scot-free, but also the Kingpin saw this as a huge sign of disrespect, with Peter Parker continuing to operate in his city. But when Wesley and the scientists show the Kingpin their air quotes discovery, which is a solution to him getting better and destroying Peter Parker, we now discover that this symbiote is indeed the same symbiote. Which at the time when we got this cliffhanger, it was kind of hard to tell, because when the symbiote took hold of Reed Richards, it started rolling out a ton of other symbiotes, so it was kind of hard to say if this was the same one or one of the others that it introduced. And on top of that, this story's being picked up by writer Jason Lowe, so it's one of those cases where once the baton is passed, the next writer is building that universe. But as we come back, some time has passed. Peter and the Fantastic Four have fought off the Skrulls together, they fought Galactus, they fought Doom, and this whole time the Kingpin is just as disgusted with Parker as he was in Spider Shadow. But also since then, his scientists have been working on the procedure to bond him with the symbiote, and Fisk has been working on a plan to separate Peter from the other members of the Fantastic Four so that when he's ready, he can perform an isolated attack. Which from here now takes us forward a month at Midtown Hospital, where a fundraiser is being held to support new technology that Peter's donated, which originally was designed by the late Reed Richards, though modified by Peter to make it more user-friendly. for both the staff and the patients. But when Peter steps away to visit some of the kids downstairs at the hospital, Congressman Esposito tells Peter that he probably shouldn't swing down there because he might scare some of the older patients, so Peter takes the elevator instead. But as soon as he gets in, his spider sense goes off, with the elevator sending him to an empty floor, and when he steps out, he hears the voice of the Kingpin from down the hallway, telling him how he blackmailed Congressman Esposito to get him to put on that convincing performance, with Fisk having quite a bit of dirt on the guy. And off the rip, Peter's not only surprised to see the Kingpin, but he's also impressed, because he's just like, man, you found a really good plastic surgeon. Because you know, the last time they met, Peter pushed his Fisk all the way back. And as it turns out, the Kingpin was able to distract the other members of the Fantastic Four by getting his scientists to send out a distress signal in the negative zone to keep them occupied, leaving Peter here all alone. So Peter lets Fisk know he was a different person back then. He was completely out of control when he wore the symbiote, and he didn't know his strength most of the time. But the way he sees it, if Fisk wants to go toe-to-toe, Peter tells him that he doesn't need the symbiote to give him 2 black eyes, only for Fisk to tell him that the shoe's on the other foot now, as he reveals that he now has the Venom symbiote. And going forward, the name is now King Pain. And as you would imagine, Peter is just completely shocked. He thought the symbiote was completely destroyed in that blast, every ounce of it, only to find out now that it survived and it's bonded to Kingpin. So yeah, he's cracking jokes, but Peter's looking for the nearest exit, cause he knows how lethal he was with the symbiote, so he can imagine just how lethal the Kingpin's gonna be, or the King Pain. That name tickles me. But with Peter trying to make his escape, it isn't long before he realizes that Fisk thought this through thoroughly, cause all exits are blocked on this floor, which then forces Peter to turn around and try to fight/reason with Fisk, since his first option's a no-go, and it isn't long before the symbiote cuts Peter, drawing first blood. So Peter cranks it up a bit, going after Fisk, sticking and moving, trying different angles, but the King Pain doesn't budge. And eventually, after getting tired of just standing there, Fisk grabs Peter's arm, slams him into the ground, and palms Peter's head while telling him, "This is where you die, Parker." And while he's squeezing Peter's head tighter and tighter, eventually, a red scythe comes through his back. As a voice comes through the vent saying, "Ooh, caught me a big meaty juicy one." And man, let me tell you, Peter's like, "Oh, didn't know there was a red one. Let me go check on my teammates." And he's out of there like he don't need to see nothing else. That man gone. But it's here now, where the Carnage from Earth 616 has made its way to this universe for its Venom symbiote. And for Fisk, who's caught up in the moment, he's like, "I almost had him. You let him get away." Only for Carnage to tell him, "Man, you took your sweet time," as he lets Fisk know that he's here for him. And Carnage just one-shots him, only to then absorb the symbiote from Spider's shadow, which now ends Extreme Venomverse, taking us into Death of the Venomverse. But as Carnage walks away, he says something rather interesting and a little scary, because he tells Fisk, "Every fiber of you feels dense. A shame it didn't save you from a good old-fashioned impaling. But don't worry, maybe when this is all over, I'll switch to destroying all the Spider-Men." Which right there is kind of like, wait, what? And so now real quick, I want to give a special shout out to all the patrons. Thank you guys for all of your support. And for anyone who's new here, who wants more information on how to support the channel, I got a link below where you can go to patreon.com/Dopespill. But that'll do it for this one, guys. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and we'll do it again on the next one. Alright, later.